I'm Charlotte McLeod with the Investing News Network, and here today with me is Richard Carleton, CEO of the CSE. Thanks so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Of course. And you are just back from a Grit Capital event in Israel. Can you tell me about your time there and the takeaways that you had?
Yeah, this is actually my fourth trip to Israel in the last 2 years or so. Our first with the folks from Grit Capital. And I think, as everybody knows, Israel is a real hotbed of startup companies. I think the technology sector largely gets served by the U.S. venture capital and private equity community. But for obvious reasons, the cannabis industry in Israel can't look to those traditional sources of capital for Israeli startup businesses. And with the expertise, obviously, that we've developed in Canada over the last several years in the cannabis space, especially in the corporate finance area, we think there's a great opportunity to work with these companies to bring them to Canada, get them publicly listed, and of course, and most importantly, raise significant amounts of growth capital for these companies. So I was going to say, the reason that Israel is a hotbed of innovation in the space, I guess, is driven by the fact that they have had a very long-standing medical cannabis program. The Israeli military has been very aggressive in terms of using cannabis products to combat PTSD disorders. And they're also, of course, very capable in the life sciences arena generally. So a lot of the cutting-edge research in terms of the chemistry of the plant, the different substances, the cannabinoids, the flavonoids, as well as the THC compounds, and the therapeutic effects and benefits of the compounds in different combinations, different mixtures, and so on. Most of the cutting-edge research globally has actually been done in Israel. So the companies that are looking to access the public or the public capital markets in Canada tend to have a lot of intellectual property in the space and are very focused, maybe not so much on cultivation, but on actual products at the consumer level, let's say.
Yeah, definitely that feeds into my next question, which is, we've been hearing about these listings coming from cannabis in Israel. What types of companies are we going to see that are listing? And that gives some idea. Do you have anything else you would add?
Yeah, again, it's a very broad spectrum of activity. So we saw one company that they have a cannabis perfume that they have put together. But delivery technologies, seed genetics, growing technologies, as well as I mentioned, pharmaceutical products that have different combinations of compounds from the cannabis plant are all really part of the offering that you'll see from these Israeli companies.
Okay, so a very wide range. Speaking more broadly about cannabis, can you give investors an update on the amount of capital raised so far for cannabis companies on the CSE this year?
Yeah, the cannabis sector has raised about $800 million to date so far, and that's about the same pace as we were in the year 2018. A lot of money actually was raised in late 2018 by the U.S. multi-state operators. And we expect that we'll see more of those U.S. companies joining the exchange, which should bump up those capital raise numbers quite considerably. Last year in total on the exchange was $5.2 billion. Of that, about $3 billion was raised by U.S. cannabis companies. So it was obviously a very important part of the capital formation that was executed on the exchange last year.
Can you give an idea of the number of cannabis listings we might see coming up?
We listed last year about 125 companies. Of that, about 45 or so were cannabis issuers. I think we're about the same rate this year, so that kind of number. I think the difference is we're seeing fewer companies that have a focus on Canada, and increasingly not just companies that with business interests in the United States. We're also seeing companies from South America. We've had interest from the Caribbean Basin. Obviously, Israel is an area of focus. We have one company from Asia that's exploring opportunities in the Thailand market. So increasingly what investors are going to see are companies that have got business interests literally all over the world.
Okay, so one thing that's been happening since legalization, there's been some questioning of, is the interest still there in cannabis. What's your sense of that? Is it more that we're seeing it come from less from North America and more from further away?
Well, I think, again, if you look even at the behavior of the Canadian issuers at this point, who've been awarded very high multiples and an ability to raise a lot of capital, you see that they're also investing outside of Canada in an opportunity, I think, to diversify their revenue flows as the companies grow. And I think, again, you see that same thesis in the companies that are coming to market. Again, fewer and fewer that have a focus on Canada, and more that are coming to us from international places. But what I will say is that we really haven't even scratched the surface in the United States yet. There are so many states and such a large percentage of the population that aren't in a legalized recreational state yet. And again, we think that there's going to continue to be tremendous investment opportunities represented by companies coming to us from the U.S.
Okay, that's great. So we've talked a lot about cannabis. Where else are you seeing market developments coming to the CSE? What other areas? I know eSports is quite hot right now. I don't know what else you're seeing.
Well, it's an oldie but a goodie. The mining industry is very quietly having a rebound, at least in terms of financing and listing activity. I'm expecting that, based on current rates, we may list 50 new mining companies this year. And they have, by and large, been able to, they've been able to raise capital. Principally in the gold space, although there continues to be also some interest in the battery metals as well. Esports is an interesting area. I think a lot of people are trying to figure out what the right investment thesis is for the space. I mean, we know it's popular. There's more and more money involved. There are more companies that are doing interesting things in the space. The idea now is, as an investor, how do you look to share in the growth of this phenomenon? And I think we're going to be talking to a lot of people about that, and we're hosting an event in Vancouver on June 19th to try and help people, I guess, understand what the different opportunities are now and perhaps where the space is headed.
Yeah, like in cannabis, that breaks down into so many different segments. I would imagine it's the same with esports, and we may start seeing some of that segmentation that people can look at.
It could well be. All I know is that I'm old enough that I used to yell at my kids for playing video games too much. So, again, it's also ironic that I got as heavily involved in the cannabis industry as I did. So, sometimes you just don't know where you're going to find out.
Yeah, and just going back to resources for a minute, that is great to hear that you're seeing that activity. I think at a lot of the events that we've been to recently, we have not had very good sentiment. So and especially in the summer when it's usually a quieter period, it's nice to see that you're seeing some good activity there.
Yeah, there is. Now, again, in aggregate, the numbers aren't enormous that these companies are raising, but again, that is obviously typical of the Canadian exploration space, that to complete a first phase of a drill program is typically the companies are looking to raise at most a few $1 million kind of thing, as opposed to some of the cannabis deals that we've seen with, for example, Curaleaf last year raising $550 million on a single transaction. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, just as we wrap up, can you tell me what the CSE has in the works for the rest of 2019?
Well, we've got a couple of big projects. One of them is that we will be developing a new rule book for our senior issuers. This is important for a couple of reasons. One, the members of this senior board, those securities will be margin eligible. For investors, that means that they will be able to hold those securities in a margin account, and it should improve the liquidity and reduce costs for folks. This board will also give us the ability to list ETFs and special purpose acquisition corporations, and so that will again give investors more product choice on the market. And last but not least, we're also working on a new clearing and settlement system for Canada. It's blockchain based, but the idea here is not so much to focus on the technology, but what it will do for us. And we're intending to position the Canadian Securities Exchange as a venue for issuers to list these so-called tokenized securities, which they could be conventional equity, common equity, or preferred shares, convertible debentures, rights and warrants, and so on. but we have a feeling that it will most likely be income-producing type products, whether they're royalty streams or other dividend-generating instruments. For issuers, we think it will reduce their cost of capital by giving them new opportunities to securitize parts of their business. And for investors, high-quality income-producing assets that are exchange traded so that they have liquidity and the ability to buy and sell more of these particular instruments. So that will likely be 2020 before we've have the first trades on those instruments, but we're very excited about the potential of the technology to reduce the costs and to deliver new products for investors.
Okay, well, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing those updates.
Thank you very much.
Once again, I'm Charlotte McLeod with the Investing News Network, and this is Richard Carleton of the CSE.